talking about the Jones Act with two people who have an incredible amount of knowledge on this particular subject. Dr. Sal Mercogliano, who joins us from Buies Creek, North Carolina, a professor of history, maritime history as well. And then also we have with us Lauren Began, the maritime professor, who is joining us here as well. And I feel like one of you is going to sue the other for trademark infringement at some point because of your similar monikers there as well. We're going to be talking about the Jones Act here. So Sal, just give us a very quick overview. For those that don't know, what is the Jones Act?
Sure. So the Jones Act is the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, and specifically what you're talking about is Section 27, which requires that any cargo moved between U.S. ports be carried on a U.S.-built, U.S.-flagged, U.S.-owned, and U.S.-crewed vessel. Now, foreign flag ships can bring cargo in and out of U.S. ports. They just can't carry them between U.S. ports.
So with that, Lauren, let me jump over to you, and we can talk about Section 27, but obviously there are some other aspects of it as well. What are some of the other main objectives of the Jones Act gives us?
Oh, sorry, was that to me?
Yes, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, so so one of the major parts is that there's some national security elements to it. So having it be U.S. owned, U.S. built, U.S. crewed, once you're starting to get into some of the inside areas, if you're going from U.S. port to U.S. port, for the most part, it kind of feels a little more intimate to the U.S. So there's some national security elements that you'd prefer maybe to have some U.S. presence on that vessel and significant U.S. presence.
So let's talk a little bit about, you talk about national security. The Jones Act comes basically out of World War II, post-World War I environment, and I think, and this may have nothing to do with it at all, but there was also the Halifax explosion, which happened in 1917. And for those of you that don't know, that's where basically a French ship went into Halifax with 2.1 kilotons of TNT, exploded, killing basically 1,700 people, injuring 9,000 in the process. But with that, you can certainly see that's kind of more or less a post 9/11 kind of reaction to it. But as far as what we're talking about here today, in terms of national security, what are terms of that, as well as the fact that you have to be U.S. flagged, U.S. crewed? What are the major controversies that we're talking about here, Sal, in terms of why people have such a disagreement about this particular act?
Sure. So as you said, Bill, it came out of World War I. And one of the issues we found coming out of World War I was we were really dependent on foreign shipping to move our international cargo. And one of the things that really saved us in both World War I and World War II was having a large coastal fleet that we tapped into when war hit. Now, after World War II, we see the decline of that coastal fleet because of things like the interstate highway system, the interstate pipeline system, and the fact that people tend to move around this country by airplane and cars less than by trains. And so trains can start picking up more freight. So what we've seen is the precipitous decline of ships along the coastal fleet, along with the decline of our international fleet. And what that means is today, and particularly in the tanker field, basically, Jones Act tankers cover the areas where there are no pipelines. So, for example, from the Gulf Coast of the United States, you have tankers that haul both clean and crude product to places like Florida, New York, New Jersey, and New England. And then from the West Coast, coming off the North Slope, down the Valdez to the West Coast to refineries. So understand that basically our entire energy system in terms of oil is covered by both pipelines, trucks, rail, but also by sea. And the problem today we have is there's very little kind of almost cushion factor in terms of tankers, so that when something happens, for example, with the Colonial Pipeline, as it did last year, we find ourselves without enough tankers to fill up that shortage.
So, as you mentioned, the amount of ships, of course, has declined. I think the statistics were that we had, 16% of the international fleet was American flagged at one point, and now we're down to less than 1%. If I'm quoting the article here that we're talking about, Rachel Premack's article, which came out earlier this week. Lauren, as things have changed over time, is the Jones Act perhaps maybe a bit antiquated, or does it need to be updated? What's your take on it at this point?
I think the problem is the funding is dried up. So in the 80s, there was really a shift of a decrease in funding to support the program. So, if you want to maintain some of these levels of security, and the security piece is not just the American presence, but it's also having the control over the labor and the safety that's on board. And so kind of speaking to that Halifax example that you gave, having a little bit more control over the safety and understanding of what's actually happening on that vessel is important. And so, in order to make sure that it's a fully thriving program, we're going to need to put some money toward it. Today we only have 46, I think is the number, sometimes upwards of 60 ships. That is so small. We really need to be funding, we need these shipbuilding operations. We need to be, hiring and employing our American crews that are part of our merchant marine. We just need to be putting a little bit more support behind the program if this is the program that we want to maintain. And I think a lot of people do want to maintain it.
Sal, let me throw the same question to you in terms of, is the Jones Act antiquated? Would you rewrite it? And if so, what would you change?
No, I think we need reform. Obviously, the problem you have in the Jones Act bills is very simple, is those who support the Jones Act and those who oppose the Jones Act sit on their mountaintops, and none of them are going to take a step off the mountaintops. It is the designated hitter issue in baseball. It's Alabama versus Auburn. There's no in between in this issue. And what you really need is reform. There needs to be some reform. Ships are not built the same way they were 100 years ago. A lot of ships are assembled from parts from all around the world. And that becomes an issue when you want to build a Jones Act vessel. And the problem you have is a lot of people will highlight the fact that Jones Act vessels are very expensive to build in the U.S. And that's because we're not building a lot of ships in the U.S. Ships are being built in China, Korea, and Japan. 93% of all the world's ships are built there. And when you build a ship in the United States, it's a one-off. When you build one ship, it's a work of art. It's not a ship because you have to fabricate every little piece. It's like building your own F-150 from scratch. It's going to cost you more. You got to build everything versus that. And so there needs to be reform. The problem is those who support the Jones Act don't want to see any reform for fear that we're heading down a path that leads to its repeal, whereas those who want repeal of the Jones Act believe it's the panacea. Repeal the Jones Act and gas will magically drop to $2 a gallon and all the world's problems are healed. And the problem is there's no evidence that that will happen at all, because what we saw during this crisis was foreign tankers pulling gas and oil out of the U.S. to go to higher price markets like Europe. The Jones Act is a dedicated fleet to haul fuel along the U.S. coast.
So, Lauren, continuing on those lines, I mean, some people have said, well, let's just waive the Jones Act for a period of time or so forth. Does that work, or is that getting us on the slippery slope headed towards repeal?
So I think that there's certainly some instances where it's valid, and usually it's kind of in a time of crisis. It's in a time of extreme need. And when those exceptions and exemptions happen, they are very specific, very targeted. Recent examples, probably best known examples would be, when hurricanes hit. So Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, it's helping to move oil from the Gulf Coast area. It's helping Strategic Petroleum Reserve oil pipelines when they were without power. So it's very targeted in when we do these exemptions. As a general matter, I don't think that that's somewhere that we want to be. I think that we do, like Sal was saying, I think that it's important to have modifications here and there. I think that it's important to be able to come down off the hill, but also we need to make sure that the essence of the law is still being maintained. And so if we start to make too many exemptions, then what is the law even good for? And so that's why if we do make exemptions, we need to make them very specific, very targeted for a temporal period, so that it's not just an open exemption. And we really need to do it for a purpose. And so when we talk about oil, this is a major piece. This is something that if we're going to be trying to get gas prices down, it's going to be more than just piecemeal here and there. And the evidence, just like Sal said, isn't there for having the exemption for the gas movement here, the oil movement, to really make a significant difference.
Well, we've got about a minute and a half here left between both of you. Let me ask you both of you this: in terms of what we're seeing on both sides of this argument, what do you see as the future of the Act itself? Sal, I know you've commented and written an article about another 100 years of the Jones Act, but what do you see as the future of this particular piece of legislation as it moves forward into its second century?
Well, I think with the recent passage of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, there's movement in Congress to relook at laws and to relook at how we do shipping. We've looked now at international shipping with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. I think it's time we look at coastal shipping. And I think we need to go ahead and look at that type of reform. Representative Garamendi from California is introducing new legislation concerning this, but I think there needs to be a panel led by groups interested in this, both pro and against, along with the government and interested parties, to see what we need to do to enforce new coastal shipping, particularly short sea shipping, which could help alleviate a lot of the backlogs that we're seeing in ports, on roads, and rails.
Okay, Lauren?
I agree with that. The short sea shipping, it's a tongue twister. So MARAD, the Maritime Administration, is housed inside the Department of Transportation, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and they are the promotional sector for the U.S. flag fleet. And so that is their prerogative. Their directive is to be supporting the U.S. flag fleet. And so, like I said, we really need to be supporting the Jones Act through financial funding and financial programs. And certainly MARAD does that through grant programs to try to facilitate and encourage short sea shipping. And so through that, what does that mean? So that's barging. So that's moving from U.S. port to U.S. port via barge. And so what that does is, if we have one truck with one cargo container on it, if we were to barge, we could potentially move some of that cargo onto a barge and have, 20, 50, 100 containers on. And that's just going to reduce the traffic that's on the road. It's an option. I think that it's something that it's really imperative that we as a United States not just look at our ocean shipping and global supply chain, but we also look at our domestic fleet. We look at our domestic our directives and initiatives, and we really kind of examine.
Well, as Sal said, it's like Auburn, Alabama, which is spoken just like an Alabama fan would say that, perhaps, anyway. Both of you, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to how the future of the Jones Act worked out.
Roll Tide.
Thank you. Great to see you.
As well there, Sal. We'll take a short break, come back after this, and wrap up this edition of Fair Waves Now.